Arab-Turkish relations actually demands constant inquiry and studies. I myself own a sizable archival collection, including documents in Ottoman Turkish, written in Arabic alphabets. In fact, those were the property of a man who served in the Ottoman army for 1 year before he traveled to Alexandria, lived in Cairo for a while, then came to the States in 1913. The picture is more complicated than we would like to believe. In fact, depending on the period we're discussing here, Islam in general, or the Ottoman Empire itself, was the last vestiges of an era where frontier borders did not exist as we know them today. And national identity did not exist in the way that it does today. At the time, it was ecumenical. For example, today we associate Catholicism with France, Protestantism with England, and so on and so forth. The Ottoman Empire was truly a global Islamic empire, as were the Abbasid and the Umayyad dynasties before it. So it didn't have frontier borders, and anyone of its subject would be just that, just for the simple reason of living there. So there was a measure of autonomy in Egypt, for example, in Arabic-speaking territories, Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula, although Ottoman influence did not spread to all of Saudi Arabia, but only to the western part, in order to maintain the pretext that they are the guardians of Islam. As a matter of fact, the guardian of Mecca lived in Istanbul as a guest. You can put that in quotes in the latter years of the Ottomans. But yes, people were tolerated and accepted for what they were. Arabic was spoken. However, things began to change because of Western encroachment into the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. I am one who believes that the Ottoman Empire spared the Arab Middle East unspeakable violence longer than other areas were actually enjoyed. For example, the Europeans, the English and the British and the Portuguese and the Spanish were all over the place. The British and the French were in Southeast Asia already, in India and Vietnam. Africa was torn to shreds by Western Europeans as well. The Ottoman Empire kept Europe out of the Middle East longer than any place else on the planet. However, those were changing times, rapidly changing times. That age of exploration paid off for the Europeans. Their influence and wealth began to rise just when the Ottoman Empire's influence began to decline, when trade routes bypassed them to the Far East and the wealth of the East. Not only silk, but mostly spice, which was a way to preserve food and give it flavor in Europe. So as a matter of fact, the Ottomans' power and influence began by serving as a conduit for trade in Western Anatolia. So when it became a vast, powerful empire with its own economy and was incorporated into a global economy, Europeans began to steadily gain the upper hand ever since the 1683 Ottoman attempt to breach the gates of Vienna. And that was the beginning of decline for the Ottomans. And with this change came the need for reforms and modernization. And after the French Revolution in the 18th century, you have this idea of the nation state emerging, that sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty, that on a defined piece of land, like-minded people, the same customs, traditions, more or less the same religion, can live in sovereignty next to other sovereign states. All of that was new in the Middle East. and there was intense pressure on the Ottomans to modernize quickly. In their haste for modernization, for at least for a time, there was a strong feelings which began as reformist ideas to create a Turkish state, hence, Turkism, and ultimately Kemal Ataturk and the triumvirate, Enver Pasha and Talat and militant members of the Turkish oligarchy. So at that time, in order to preserve this Turkish state, it had to have a uniform language, uniform customs, project itself as a nation state. And the Turks were reluctant to give up the Arab provinces, who began to grumble and ask for autonomy. That's when an opening for the French colonialism and British colonialism opened up. So the British did not wait. They were in Egypt in 1882, occupied the place, which was technically part of the Ottoman Empire, and stifled any modernization during that time. In the Arab provinces, the French, under the pretext of extending protection to their co-religionists, the so-called Maronites or an offshoot of Catholicism, they managed to create an administrative district, or mutasarrifiyya, as it's called in Turkish, around the area of Beirut, which ultimately they separated from this geographic area we call natural Syria or geographic Syria. That was by the mid-19th century, as a matter of fact. Many Arabs were saying, we cannot wait, we have to have our own autonomy. And it was different methods that were applied in order to achieve independence. So the Islamists, Islamic reformers, said we should remain part of the Ottoman Empire. We are Muslims. They are the guardians of Islam. And they began to change their mind and ask for more and more autonomy. But they were very sophisticated in that they recognized that the British and the French were waiting to pounce on the Turkish Ottoman Empire. And they understood that if, in fact, the Ottoman Empire collapses, it will be replaced by the French and the British. Ultimately, that's exactly what happened. So I liken the situation to sort of a walnut under the, two parts of a vice, a nutcracker, if you will, squeezing. And those two parts are the British and the French, who, as a matter of fact, were afraid of each other because they were at wars with each other for a long time and held off until World War I. When World War I ended, during which the Arabs made a fateful decision to join the Allies against the Ottomans, Turks, and the Germans, with the promise by the British to grant them autonomy, as a matter of fact, to grant them independence in natural Syria, an area that includes Syria proper, the western fringe of Iraq maybe, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. That was called Bilad al-Sham in Arabic, or geographic Syria. Of course, the British and the French had no intention of keeping their promises, because a year before this, a few months at least before they made those promises, they entered into what is called the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan among themselves into spheres of influence. And the contours of that agreement more or less correspond to the political map of the Middle East as we know it today. So some people saw through all this. Some important nationalists, among them Shakib Arsalan, an important Druze intellectual, who knew what was coming. So did members of those anti-Ottoman reformist societies who wanted autonomy and who did not feel like they were getting a fair shake by the CUP, for the Committee for Union and Progress. And they knew that if the Ottoman Empire collapses, foreign occupation will set in, namely French and British. Precisely what happened after World War I. So Arab-Turkish relations are very complex. They are part of a similar historical, cultural narrative. When I spent time in Istanbul, I felt at home. I can't even describe it, to be honest with you. I could understand every other word I could read in Turkish. The food, the smells, the people, the manners, the hospitality were all familiar. As a matter of fact, listening to songs, you find out that songs you grew up with are actually Turkish songs. From that period when the two people grappled with a very, very complex, changing political situation. But the cultural ties are extremely strong. It can never be severed between Turks and Arabs because they shared the common history for nearly 5 centuries. Yet, Western encroachment infused both peoples with a distinct political agenda in order to create their nation states. There was no way around that. And the result of that was this irrational, frankly, extremely painful anti-Muslim feelings in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, which persist to this day. And most people don't understand that Turks and Greeks lived in peace and harmony for a long time, and it was the Greek Fidik Hatera, or the Society of Friends, who basically took this idea of nationalism to an extreme and began to engage in violence against Turks and Greeks alike, which invited a response by the Turks. And of course, the French and the British intervened with their own interests in mind, precisely what they did between Maronites and Druze in Syria itself. So at the end of the day, it was an end of an era. It was a cycle of rise, after which you can only decline, frankly, in the case of the Ottoman Empire. And it was time for Arabs to run their affairs if they can. And they tried their best to navigate both Ottomanist, modernist, and secular trends and they tried to navigate a middle of the road path. Unfortunately, when Turkey lost in World War I to the Allies, the French and the British just moved in and made true on their promises to each other of carving spheres of interest, of influence in the Arab world.
You have been in Istanbul, so you saw a lot of Ottoman buildings and mosques and architects. What you are thinking, the architects of Ottoman? What do you think? I mean, what's your imagination about the architects of Ottoman Empire? Because you saw in Istanbul. Have you been in Sultanahmet Mosque? Or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So what do you think about their style?
As I mentioned, it really all looked familiar, although it had this distinctive Turkish style, especially in the mosques. But when I entered the mosque in Istanbul, or for that matter, an old Orthodox church, I felt the same way I did when I entered the Holy Sepulchre or Al-Aqsa Mosque in Palestine. It becomes tangible, the fact that that we are part of a similar cultural narrative. Islam is the same Islam in Istanbul as it is in other parts of the Arab world. The architecture kind of emphasizes that, all those archways, and in some parts of Istanbul, you could be walking in the old city of Jerusalem, like the Kasbah, the big marketplace, is very, very close to how Jerusalem is actually set up, which is no accident, because Ottomans built most of it, for the matter, as a matter of fact, or at least presided over its development. I don't know
Yeah,
else to say
about
about that.
the Ottoman architects. Yeah, not so big difference, but there is some small difference. In Ottoman architects, if you compare with Arabic mosques and
Yeah, there's some differences. Yes,
Difference,
I mean the domes, the use of the domes and the square.
yeah,
But-
Mimar Sinan, he brings some dome style more. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm not an expert on
yeah,
architecture,
okay, just
but the mihrab faces Mecca. I mean, the once you're inside, it is very, very similar. Al-Aqsa and Hagia Sophia looks very familiar too, as a mosque. I mean, it's like Byzantine influence also there.
according to you, your personal idea, what was the reason that Ottoman lived centuries to century, like more than 600 years is long period for living for a nation, not nation, a state.
I mean, lasted.
Yeah, how they lived so long, because they didn't live only Arabic countries. They have been in Europe, some Africa, some. So they mix up with a lot of cultures. I mean, they were there, soldiers and government, but they lived so long. What was the reason live alive?
Lead or lived?
Lived.
Lived, yeah.
I mean, how they lived so long? It was more than 600 years.
Yeah.
The Ottoman were existing. So what was the reason of that, according to you? What was their success?
Yeah. Well, there are like geopolitical global changes that opened the door for the Ottomans to, first of all, to establish their dynasty and spread as far and wide as they did, and to last for as long as they did, from the 1280s all the way to World War I. And these have to do with a very refined and considered process of preparing leaders, young leaders, for the rule. And there are also economic reasons, and Bursa in Western Anatolia was a gateway between East and West. So all the silk and the spices came from the Far East, which Europe could hardly do without, came through the small dynasty which began by Uthman and his son Orhan. And those are the folks who established a small dynasty which became very wealthy. And around it, there was a huge void, political void, cultural void, because of years of conflict. What created that void were the Mongol invasions, which were brutal and extremely destructive. That's when the libraries in Baghdad, holding 400,000 volumes of books, were ditched in the river, turning the water of the river black with ink, as the folklore says. That wreaked havoc into the remnants of the Arab Islamic dynasties, and that's when the Ottomans, who became committed Muslims, found an opening in order to preserve the faith and also grow and expand. So from that small dynasty in Western Anatolia, Europe was there for the taking, where it was no comparison between the high level of culture, even in times of war, within the Islamic realm and Europe at the time. So the East had a great deal to offer to the West, and the Ottomans were privy to this high culture, all the scientific innovations, industrial innovations, and trade, and high culture and literature. So the Ottomans were actually emulated by the West for a very, very long period of time. And of course, they spread wherever there was a void within a measured and nuanced process of well-planned marriages by the sultans, by the Ottoman sultans themselves, and by establishing the palace services and in a very elaborate system of centralized government. and granting, land grants for their sipahis and or the mounted cavalry and etc., etc. So they were able to bring in many cultures, many cultural narratives into the fold, into this realm of Ottoman rule, and govern from Istanbul itself, from a central location. But the key, I think, was the meticulous and highly sophisticated process of preparing future sultans that won the day, who, by the way, were in competition with each other very often.